Hello, everyone, and welcome back to a rare off-schedule episode of the Dbacks podcast, Arizona's #1 baseball and beverage podcast. I'm your host, GB Diamondback. Today, I've got pumpkin spice tea in front of me in honor of it finally getting chilly enough to drink fall season drinks here in London. I'm not sure if I'm going to like it, but it's on brand. And speaking of fall, Halloween is coming up, and first things first, I will address the title of today's episode, the Rocky Horror Picture Show, which, as snappy and clever and as delighted with that as I am, I appreciate it is a little bit of a melodramatic title, but, the D-backs are putting out fires all over the place at the moment, so, might as well have fun with the title while I've got stuff to complain about before we go and become the best team in baseball randomly in the postseason again. Right, let's get on with it. First, let's have a sip of this tea. Okay, I'm probably not gonna have any more of that this episode. Let's talk baseball instead of tea because I can't get that taste out of my mouth. Right, let's talk against this series that the D-backs recently gave up to the Rockies to start with, because that's where, things really started to go wrong. We had a rough one against the Brewers going into this series, but we thought, oh, okay, yeah, we can turn it around. Got the Rockies coming up. That's a series potentially you can get a couple of wins, maybe even get the sweep at Coors Field. And, of course, that just didn't happen. Game 1 lost 2-3. It was a bit of a tight game. Merrill Kelly wasn't that bad. His final line was 6 IP, 2 H, 1 ER, and only 5 struck out, however. And then Ryan Thompson's ruthlessness has sort of gone AWOL. He used to be this guy who you could absolutely rely on to put a fire out, put up a scoreless inning, etc., etc. That just wasn't the case for Ryan Thompson, and he earned the L in that particular game. And then really there was no run support. The bats randomly went cold when, Colorado is a place you can expect your bats to get hot, and we really needed that. And it just didn't come for the Diamondbacks, which really kind of sucked. And then game 2, we lost 2-8, and yeah, that was a bad one. We thought, maybe it's okay to give up the first game in tight circumstances, but, Jordan Montgomery coming in, I don't think anybody left in this D-backs fandom has any confidence left in Jordan Montgomery, and he seems to have sucked all the confidence out of himself as well. He returned to the rotation as a starter, and really he looked out of his depth. Like, we thought maybe spending some time from the bullpen as a length guy would do him some good without putting so much of the pressure that he struggled with on his shoulders, and that just hasn't been the case. Montgomery's finishing line at the end of game 2 is through 79 pitches, 50 for strikes, but he only lasted 4 2/3, allowing 3 runs, 6 hits, and 2 walks in that time. And then the bad news just continued for the Diamondbacks, because guess who's back? Scott McGough is back in the Diamondbacks bullpen, and most of you who listened last year will know what my feelings about him are, and he returned with a usual disaster class and a 7.20 ERA. So yeah, we lost that one 2-8, and the bats were cold, but I think the pitching kind of lost us the game on that one. Game 3 against the Rockies, we got a win, which, avoiding getting swept by the Rockies was fairly low down on our list of achievements that we want to be aiming for in this season. But, we still have to pat ourselves on the back and say, okay, we stopped the slide a little bit. The run support carried to get the bats hot early, 3 runs in the first, and Erod was, pretty lights out. I think it's his first real game where we started to see exactly what he's all about as a pitcher, and why he's been, so hotly expected to come back and make an impact as the Diamondbacks push towards the potential second postseason in a row. But, what I want to talk about today is we still need some more cutthroat performances, and I think let's talk about Dylan Floro as an example of this. He's a guy who's been DFA'd. He's no longer with the D-backs organization. Obviously a veteran pitcher, had time quite effectively in Washington at the Nationals, but he, I think, is the latest culprit of becoming far too hittable, and He got DFA'd this week after 16 and 1/3 innings pitched during his time at the Diamondbacks in the majors. In that time, it was 17 earned runs off of 23 hits, including 4 homers, and he only walked. Yeah, he only walked 4, which isn't that bad, but he only struck out 8 people in 16 and a third innings. So one strikeout per each inning you pitch just isn't good enough when you're a pitcher. And when you're a pitcher when you look to a veteran arm, you expect them to have their composure, know what to do in any situation, take the pressure off of the bats if the bats are struggling. You need that from those kind of older, more experienced guys. And I think as much as we're starting to become a bit of a retirement home for pitchers who might be past their best, and we've always had a bit of that reputation anyway, Floro was not there performing that role even. And so we saw the same with Paul Sewald towards the bulk of the middle of the season this year. He was a guy who had that closer role and was losing his games because he was throwing meatballs. And when Dylan Floro was throwing fastballs, he's not even hitting 90s. He's throwing an 88-mile-an-hour fastball, and you can't expect somebody where that's supposed to be your put-away pitch. You can't expect somebody to throw that in the majors and still be able to make a career on that. And the nail in the coffin was 2 innings, giving up 5 runs and 5 hits and 2 homers on the 15th against the Brewers, who of course are now NL Central champions. So yeah, that's a bit of a disappointing one for Dylan Floro, and really we need to start looking at some alternatives of what our bullpen could look like and what our bullpen needs to look like going into what could be the most important 2 weeks of our entire season, with a bit of a slump going on. But speaking of the Brewers, they provided just the test we needed to spark potentially a bit of a turnaround going into the weekend, hence why I'm recording an episode on a Friday. This is coming off of the back of Game 1 against the Brewers last night. So Thursday last night, because I'm recording this on the Friday morning here in the UK. And Brandon Pfaadt was on the mound. He corrected a lot of his errors in the last couple of weeks with a pretty big performance. And I think pretty big performance is actually quite an understatement for just how good Brandon Pfaadt was last night. It kind of looked like shades of 2023, of course. The last time Brandon Pfaadt pitched at American Family Field, home of the Milwaukee Brewers, was in the sweep of the Brewers in the NL Wildcard Series last year. Pfaadt went out and struck out a career-high 12 batters over 7 innings, allowing 2 hits, and he matched a Dbacks organization record for consecutive strikeouts, fanning 7 in a row between the 4th and the 7th. And a little bit of a trivia question for you, and most of you who are on social media will already have seen the answer to this. But the only others in the Diamondbacks organization to have done that, to have got to that record, are 2 Hall of Famers. It's Randy Johnson and Curt Schilling. And most of you guys know I loved the big unit. I'm less of a fan of Curt Schilling because he's a big MAGA type, apparently. But that's the kind of thing we need. And if Pfaadt can start to deliver pitching like that, in the majority of his starts, as opposed to, kind of a third to a half of what he does at the moment, because sometimes he can look incredible and sometimes he does seem to become a bit of a liability if he doesn't settle down and bed himself into a game that well. So if Pfaadt can start to deliver that, I think we're looking at a pitcher who, when Gallen and Kelly are starting to fade off a bit, when, Rodriguez and Montgomery have probably already retired, Pfaadt's going to look to be our ace. And I think keeping him as our ace for the future, ace in the hole, is a good way of looking at it, and keep nurturing and developing his pitching however we can. But the reality is, looking at some of his performances this season, he needs to be considered one of our aces now. I know he's a young arm, but we need to be doing the best we can to give him the platform to perform, and that includes getting the run support that Kelly and Montgomery just didn't get last week in Colorado. But yeah, Pfaadt's getting more aggressive with his fastball. I think that was the key, and I think a lot of people pointed that out with both the location and velocity, and also how frequently he throws it. It used to be just a reliable go back to the fastball kind of pitch, especially when you're watching the series against the Phillies, the National League series against the Phillies last year. You see he kind of went back to that as a fallback pitch, wasn't really confident in using it all the time as a strikeout pitch, as a put away pitch. Any of you guys who really know me will know I like the old-fashioned way of, just, 2 strikes, blow a fastball right by him, just inside and over the top or underneath. But he's really started to use that more attacking the zone aggressively. Bob Brenly on the comms and Steve Bartiome really pointed out, he likes to pound the strike zone a lot more, since, mid-August. He's been doing that. And little changes like that from pitching coach Brent Strom will work wonders, but we need to keep that no mercy approach when it comes to, the rest of our pitchers, and also when it comes to our own roster and our own clubhouse. And this is sort of what I wanted to make a little bit of a rant to come in. Montgomery, jury's out on him. It's just, we can talk about whether Montgomery has a career left with the Diamondbacks until the Coyotes come home, but yeah, he needs to be gone. If he can't perform in the bullpen or in the rotation, he needs to be cut. And I know we've put a significant amount of money in, but it's only a 1-year deal. He's not happy here. He's not happy with the deal he's got from his representatives coming out of free agency, signing that deal here. He was looking for a 2 or 3 year deal, and he's made that very clear in his social media and in his press conferences, and he's now changed representation approaching his free agency this year. I think we're just going to hang on to him because, cut our losses a little bit. But he needs to be cut, and if the likes of Jarvis and Walston and Ciccone can't perform as the corresponding roster move, if you do send Montgomery down or you DFA him, then, they need to be dealt with accordingly too. I know we're missing Andrew Solfrank because of that gambling ban from all the way from the start of the season. He was a guy who we thought, maybe could be a big part of the bullpen today, and I think we have missed his presence a little bit. But, Yilba Diaz, he's a guy who's come in who was a starter when he first came up from AAA this season. He's now a bullpen guy. If we're looking at the case of, Montgomery and Thompson and McGuff, between them are conspiring to give up 8 runs in bloody Colorado, at what point do you start looking at Yilba Diaz to start a game? At what point do you try betting in, the number 8 prospects in the organization? That's Yumin Lin, who's admittedly is in AA right now. It would be a big jump, but, at what point do you start looking at these guys and thinking, okay, should they be getting a chance to get some experience? It really will depend on how this next week of baseball goes, culminating next weekend with what could be one of the biggest weekends of baseball in our entire history, with potentially a winner-takes-all clash for the wildcard spots going up against San Diego after the conclusion of this series against the Brewers. Brewers, they don't have anything left to play for in terms of the regular season. They're NL Central champions, so maybe we're hoping they've maybe had one too many beers and are going to give us a couple of off days to really capitalize on that. But we have to treat it not just like batting practice against a team that's got nothing left to play for. They're going to want to keep their momentum rolling into the postseason, and potentially we're going to play them in the postseason if we can get there. So if we can do everything we can to knock them off our stride and pick up our own pace, that's important. But yeah, it's looking like it could be a difficult one. Taking game 1 of the series against the Milwaukee Brewers last night, it's a good start. This is a 4-game series, so there's plenty of time for us to go and make some damage into the lead that the Padres have in the wild card race. Currently, we are tied with the Mets, and the Braves are creeping up at the moment. So we got to work on that. And from what's basically been, a 2-game lead over everybody and tying with the Padres, it's now we are slipping back, and we need to be careful about that. But it's good to know that we do still have some bright lights. Ketel Marte was picked up right where he left off in terms of slugging. Corbin Carroll's just picked up his second 2020 season in a row, which is cool. I know everyone's sort of frothing at the mouth that Shohei's finally reached 50-50, and, a fair play to him. That is an impressive feat, but, he's one of the best players in baseball, so I don't think anybody's remotely surprised by that. But yeah, Corbin Carroll hit 2020, so 20 stolen bases, 20 home runs in a season, and that was not something that started this year with how cold Corbin looked we thought he might be able to reach. But, we've kept the faith in him. He's not a player that, is going to do great. I think if you send him down, give him some time like we have with, Jake McCarthy or Alec Thomas in terms of our outfielders, Corbin Carroll's a guy who has to play in the majors and has to play in the majors pretty much any day he can. He's effective as a leadoff guy most of the time, giving somebody like Cattell or Jock, somebody to drive in front of them is always good for Corbin, so it's good to see that. And then, of course, Gabi Moreno has come back in at catcher, and I think he's had a significant effect on, how our starting pitchers have been doing. I know a lot of people were concerned with the move of Adrian Del Castillo going back down to AAA, and I think a lot of guys thought that was just because Jose Herrera has a good relationship with Zach Gallen in terms of a pitcher-catcher relationship, but for Pfaadt, I think, he pitches better when he knows Moreno is behind the dish. And there's a funky stat from PHX Logan on Twitter, which is floating around and I like. It's the Diamondbacks starters since Moreno returned from the injury list. That's 12.1 innings pitched, 7 hits, 3 runs, 16 Ks. I think they're much more confident throwing when they know he's behind the dish because less stuff is going to get away. We're going to stop seeing some of the little errors that, Herrera can do. ADC, obviously, defensively, as a catcher, he needs a lot of work. I don't think he caught anybody stealing in his time in the majors. Gabi Moreno gives us that confidence, that big rock to go after and say, yeah, just put the pitch where you would usually do and we'll probably do okay. So, what's happening next? Next is, of course, the rest of the series against the Brewers. And to conclude, we need some arms who are not afraid. There's too many guys in our starting rotation who lose their head too quickly with the ball in hand. And I think it's time to talk a little bit about some of the guys who could come in potentially for next year who are approaching free agency at the end of this season. There's a lot of, option contracts floating around, so let's not get too tied up in that. But let's potentially talk about some guys like the likes of Luis Severino or Yusei Kikuchi, both approaching free agency at the end of their current deals this season. I'm a big fan of Luis Severino at the Mets. He's a guy who pitched well in his start in the London series. If you remember, Toria from the UK Mets came on the podcast previewing the London series, and they talked about how expectant the weight on the shoulders of Luis Severino as a pitcher was, and he delivered upon that. So maybe we need somebody like him in place of your Jordan Montgomery, or Yusei Kikuchi. He's been pretty impressive. He's certainly would bring a lot more people into the bullpen because you'd have to have pitching that could work around his style, and you'd have to obviously change some of your catching game because he's got a very distinct motion. But it's a guy who could also bring in revenue for the club. I know we're talking about potentially what's going to happen. Are the Diamondbacks going to get their lease on Chase Field renewed? Are we going to have to move somewhere else in the valley, maybe onto one of the reservations? And I don't know nearly enough about American municipal planning to, really weigh in on that. All I would say is I like Chase Field. I've been lucky enough to go there a handful of times, to travel over, see family in Arizona while I'm out there, and I'll usually catch 1 or 2 games, which has been pretty cool. So I wouldn't change Chase Field too much. I think we're guilty of maybe closing the roof a little too often. I think atmosphere-wise, you can really change how people take in a ball game with that, and I think that can be something that we can potentially use to our advantage as well, rather than having the roof closed and it be a little bit dangerous in terms of, letting guys hit our pitches to the warning track. But speaking of pitching who wouldn't let us get to the warning track, The likes of Robbie Ray and Luke Weaver both are approaching their free agencies as well. Robbie Ray, obviously, Diamondbacks veteran, was a little bit of a favorite here if you play MLB 24 the show. He's the pitching captain for the Diamondbacks that you can acquire in your collections, and he's a card I like using, so, I'd love to see him back in a jersey. He's not been having a fantastic year, but, it would be cool to see him back. And then Luke Weaver, who is a guy who somewhat went under the radar when he was at the Diamondbacks. Previously, he was quite a raw, young bullpen arm that, I think we didn't really appreciate while we had him. He looked, obviously, a little inexperienced while he was there, but has really developed into a really impressive starter over at the Yankees this year. And that 12-6 curveball really has started to develop for him. So maybe he was a guy who we could look at as being a fourth or fifth guy if, Ryan Nelson isn't quite going to stay fit and stay up out of the injury list the whole time we need him to. Maybe that's food for thought, and I think that's a good place to end it. Of who would you like to see the Diamondbacks go after in free agency at the end of this year? Who are we trading to try and fix up this pitching situation? Or are we sticking with what we've got and hoping that whoever replaces Montgomery, because he'll be gone at the end of the year, are they going to come up from the organization? Is that going to be Yilba Diaz's spot to fight for? Is that Ryan Nelson's? Is that Tommy Henry's? Could he make a return? Who knows? But anyway, I'd like to say thank you very much for watching. Thank you very much for listening. Wherever you are, please remember to follow or subscribe to the podcast. Every little bit of support helps. I really appreciate you guys tuning in every week to listen to me talk about baseball from thousands of miles away. Thank you very much again, and I'll see you in the next one.